Chapters 65, 66, and 67 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 65, Social Revolution. How the great change is coming in different industries, and how we may prepare to meet it. From a study of the world's political revolutions, we observe that a variety of governmental forms develop, and that different circumstances in each country produce different institutions. Suppose that back in the days of the French monarchy, someone asked you how France was going to be governed as a political republic. How would elections be held? What would be the powers of the deputies? Who would choose the premier? Who would choose the president? What would be the duties of each? Who can explain why in France and England the executive is responsible to the parliament and must answer its questions, while in the United States the executive is an autocrat responsible to no one for 4 years? Who could have foreseen that in England, supposed to remain a monarchy, the constitution would be fluid, while in America, supposed to be a democracy, the Constitution would be rigid, and the supreme power of rejecting changes in the laws would be vested in a group of reactionary lawyers appointed for life? There will be similar surprises in the social revolution, and similar differences between what things pretend to be and what they are. I used to compare the social revolution to the hatching of an egg. You examine it, and apparently it is all egg. But then suddenly something begins to happen, and in a few minutes it is all chicken. If, however, you investigate, you discover that the chicken had been forming inside the egg for some time. I know that there is a chicken now forming inside our social egg. But having realized the complexity of social phenomena, I no longer venture to predict the exact time of the hatching, or the size and color of the chicken. Perhaps it is more useful to compare the social revolution to a childbirth. A good surgeon knows what is due to happen, but he knows also that there are 1,000 uncertainties, 1,000 dangerous possibilities, and all he can do is to watch the process and be prepared to meet each emergency as it arises. The birth process consists of one pang after another. No one can say which pang will complete the birth, or whether it will be completed at all. Karl Marx is the author of saying that force is the midwife of progress. So you may see that I am not the inventor of this simile of childbirth. There are 3 factors in the social revolution, each of which will vary in each country, and in different parts of the country, and at different periods. First, there is the industrial condition of the country, a complex set of economic factors. The industrial life of England depends primarily on shipping and coal. In the United States, shipping is of less importance, and railroads take the place. In the United States, the eastern portion lives mainly by manufacture, the western by agriculture, while the south is held a generation behind by a race problem. In France, the great estates were broken up, and agriculture fell into the hands of peasant proprietors, who are the main support of French capitalism. In Prussia, the great estates were held intact, and remained the basis of a feudal aristocracy. In America, land changes hands freely, and therefore 1/3 of our farms are mortgaged, and another third are worked by tenants. In Russia, there was practically no middle class, while in the United States there is practically nothing but middle class. The rich have been rich for such a short while that they still look middle class and act middle class, in spite of all their efforts, while the working class hopes to be middle class and is persuaded that it can become middle class. Such varying factors produce in each country a different problem, and make inevitable a different process of change. The second factor is the condition of organization and education of the workers. This likewise varies in every country and in every part of every country. There's a continual struggle on the part of the workers to organize and educate themselves, and a continual effort on the part of the ruling class to prevent this. In some industries in America, you find the workers 100% organized, and in other industries, you find them not organized at all. It is obvious that in the former case, the social change, when it comes, will be comparatively simple, involving little bloodshed and waste. In the latter case, there will be social convulsions, rioting and destruction of property, disorganization of industry, and widespread distress. The third factor is the state of mind of the propertied classes, the amount of resistance they are willing to make to social change. I have done a great deal of pleading with the masters of industry in my country. I have also written appeals to Vincent Astor and John D. Rockefeller, to capitalist newspapers and judges and congressmen and presidents. I have been told that this is a waste of my time, that these people cannot learn and will not learn, and that it is foolish to appeal either to their hearts or to their understanding. But I perceive that the class struggle is like a fraction. It has a numerator and a denominator, and you can increase the fraction just as well by decreasing the denominator as by increasing the numerator. To vary the simile, here are two groups of men engaged in a tug of war, and you can affect the result just as decisively by persuading one group to pull less hard as by persuading the other group to pull harder. Picture to yourself two factories. In factory number one, the owner is a hard-driving businessman, an active spirit in the so-called open shop campaign. He believes in his divine right to manage industry, and he believes also in the gospel of all that the traffic will bear. He prevents his men from organizing and employs spies to weed out the radicals and to sow dissensions. When a strike comes, he calls in the police and the strike-breaking agencies, and in every possible way he makes himself hated and feared by his workers. Then some day comes the unemployment crisis and a wave of revolt sweeping over the country. The workers seize that factory and set up a dictatorship of the proletariat and a red terror. If the owner resists, they kill him. In any case, they wipe out his interest in his business and do everything possible to destroy his power over it, even to his very name. They run the business by a shop committee, and you have for that particular factory a syndicalist or even anarchist form of social reconstruction. Now for factory number two, whose owner is a humane and enlightened man, studying social questions and realizing his responsibility and the temporary nature of his stewardship. He gives his people the best possible working conditions. He keeps open books and discusses wages and profits with them. He educates the young workers. He meets with their union committees on a basis of free discussion. When the unemployment crisis comes and the wave of revolt sweeps the country, this man and his workers understand one another. He says, I can no longer pay profits, and so I can no longer keep going under the profit system. But if you are ready to run the plant, I am ready to help you the best I can. Manifestly, this man will continue the president of the corporation. And if he trains his sons wisely, they will keep his place. So, instead of having in that factory a dictatorship and a terror, you will have a constitutional monarchy gradually evolving into a democratic republic. End of chapter 65. Chapter 66. Confiscation or compensation. Shall the workers buy out the capitalists? Can they afford to do it? And what will be the price? The problem of whether the social revolution shall be violent or peaceable depends in great part upon our answer to the question of confiscation versus compensation. We are now going to consider, first, the abstract rights and wrongs of the question, and, second, the practical aspects of it. There is a story very popular among single taxers and other advocates of freedom of the land. An English landowner met a stranger walking on his estate and rebuked him for trespassing. Said the stranger, "You own this land?" Said the other, "I do." "And how did you get it?" "I inherited it from my father." "And how did your father get it?" "He inherited it from his father." So on for half a dozen or more ancestors, until at last the Englishman answered, "He fought for it." Whereupon the stranger took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and said, "I'll fight you for it." This is all there is to say on the subject of the abstract rights of land titles. There is no title to land which is valid on a historical basis. Everything rests upon fraud and force, continued through endless ages of human history. We in the United States took most of our land from the Indians, and in the process our guiding rule was that the only good Injun was a dead Injun. We first helped the English kings to take large sections of our country from the French and Spanish, and then we took them from the English king by a violent revolution. We purchased our southwestern states from Mexico, but not until we had taken the precaution of killing some thousands of Mexicans in war, which had the effect of keeping down the purchase price. It would be a simple matter to show that all public franchises are similarly tainted with fraud. Proudhon laid down the principle that property is theft. And from this principle it is an obvious conclusion that society has the right to scrap all paper titles to wealth, and to start the world's industries over again on the basis of share and share alike. But stop and consider for a moment. Property is theft, you say. But go to your corner grocery and tell the grocer that you deny his title to the sack of prunes which he exhibits in the front of his counter. He will tell you that he has paid for them, but you answer that the prunes were raised on stolen land and shipped to him over a railroad whose franchise was obtained by bribery. Will that convince the grocer? It will not. Neither will it convince the policeman or the judge, nor will it convince the voters of the country. Most people have a deeply rooted conviction that there are rights to property, now definitely established and made valid by law. If you have paid taxes on land for a certain period, the land belongs to you. And I am sure you might agitate from now to kingdom come without persuading the American people that New Mexico ought to be returned to Mexico, or the western prairies to the Indian tribes. Such are the facts. Now, let us apply them to the right of exploitation, embodied in the ownership of a certain number of bonds or shares of stock in the United States Steel Corporation. Pass a law, says the socialist, providing for the taking over of United States Steel by the government. At once to every owner comes one single thought: are you going to buy the stock, or are you going to confiscate it? If you attempt confiscation, the courts will declare the law unconstitutional, and you either have to defy the courts, which is revolutionary action, or to amend the Constitution. If you adopt the latter course, you have before you a long period of agitation. You have to carry both houses of Congress by a 2/3 majority, and the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. You have to do this in the face of the most bitter and infuriated opposition of those who are defending what they regard as their rights. You have to meet the arguments of the entire capitalist press of the country, and you have the certainty of widespread bribery of your elected officials. The prospect of doing all this under the forms of law seems extremely discouraging. So come the syndicalists, saying, "Let us seize the factories and stop the exploitation at the point of production." So come the communists, saying, "Let us overthrow capitalist government and break the net of bourgeois legality and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which will put an end to privilege and class domination all at once." What are we to say to these different programs? Suppose we buy out the stockholders of United States Steel and issue to them government bonds. What have we accomplished? Nothing, say the advocates of confiscation. We have changed the form of exploitation, but the substance of it remains the same. The stockholders get their money from the United States government instead of from United States Steel Corporation, but they get their money just the same, the product not of their labor, but of the labor of the steel workers. Suppose we carried out the same procedure all along the line. Suppose the government took over all industries and paid for their securities with government bonds. Then we should have capitalism administered by a capitalist government instead of by our present masters of industry. We should have a state capitalism instead of a private capitalism. We should have the government buying and selling products and exploiting labor and paying over the profits to an hereditary, privileged class. The capitalist system would go on just the same, except that labor would have one all-powerful tyrant instead of many lesser tyrants, as at present. So argue the advocates of confiscation. And the advocates of purchase reply that in buying the securities of United States Steel, we should fix the purchase price at the present market value of the property, and that price, once fixed, would be permanent. All future unearned increment of the steel industry would belong to the government instead of to private owners. Consider, for example, what happened during the World War. When I was a boy, soon after the Steel Trust was launched, its stock was down to something like $6, and I knew small investors who lost every dollar they had put in. But during the war, steel stocks soared to $136 per share. It paid dividends of some 30% per year and accumulated enormous surpluses besides. The same thing was true of practically all the big corporations. According to the Secretary of the Treasury, McAdoo, there were coal companies which paid as high as 800% per year. That is to say, the profits in 1 year were 8 times the total investment. Assuming that our government bonds paid 5%, it appears that the owners of these coal companies got 160 times as much under our present private property system as they would have got under a system of state purchase. Even completely dominated by capitalism as our courts are today, they would not dare require us to pay for industries more than 6% on the market value of the investment. And from what I know of the inside graft of American big business, that would be restricting the private owners to less than 1/4 of what they are getting at present. We have already pointed out the economies that can be made by putting industry under a uniform system. But all these, important as they are, amount to little in comparison with the one great consideration, which is that by purchasing large-scale industry, we should break the iron ring. We should thenceforth be able to do our manufacturing for use instead of for profit. And so we should put an end to unemployment. Our cheerful workers would throng into the factories to produce for themselves instead of for masters, and in 1 year of that we should so change the face of our country that a return to the system of private ownership would be unthinkable. In 1 year we could raise production to such a point that the interest on the bonds we had issued would be like the crumbs left over from a feast. End of chapter 66. Chapter 67. Expropriating the expropriators. Discusses the dictatorship of the proletariat and its chances for success in the United States. I am aware that the suggestion of paying for the industries we socialize will sound tame and uninspiring to a lot of ardent young radicals of my acquaintance. They will shake their heads sadly and say that I am getting middle-aged and tired. We have seen in Russia and Hungary and other places so many illustrations of the quick and easy way to expropriate the expropriators, that now there is in every country a considerable group of radicals who will hear to no program less picturesque than barricades and councils of action. In considering this question, I set aside all considerations of abstract right or wrong, the justification for violence and the overthrow of capitalist society. I put the question on the basis of cash, pure and simple. It will cost a certain amount of money to buy out the owners, and that money will have to be paid as it is paid at present, out of the labor of useful workers. The workers don't want to pay any more than they have to. The question they must consider is, which way will they have to pay most? The advocates of the dictatorship of the proletariat are lured by the delightful prospect of not having to pay anything. And if that were really possible, it would undoubtedly be the better way. But we have to consider this question: is the program of not having to pay anything a reality, or is it only a dream? Suppose it should turn out that we have to pay anyhow, and that in the case of violent revolution we pay much more, and in addition run serious risk of not getting what we pay for. Here are enormous industries running at full blast, and it is proposed that some morning the workers shall rise up and seize them and turn out the owners and managers and run the industries themselves. Will anybody maintain that this can be done without stopping production in those factories for a single day? Certainly production must stop during the time you are fighting for possession, and the cruel experience of Russia proves that it will stop during the further time you are fighting to keep possession and to put down counter-revolutionary conspiracies. Also, alas, it will stop during the time you are looking for somebody who knows how to run that industry. It will stop during the time you are organizing your new administrative staff. You may discover to your consternation that it stops during the time you are arranging to get other industries to give you credit and to ship you raw materials. Also during the time you are finding the workers in other industries who want your product and are able to pay for it with something that you can use or that you can sell in a badly disorganized market. And all the time that you are arranging these things, you are going to have the workers at your back, not getting any pay, or being paid with your paper money, which they distrust, and growling and grumbling at you because you are not running things as you promised. You see, the mass of the workers are not going to understand, because you haven't made them understand. You have brought about the great change by your program of a dictatorship, of action by an enlightened minority, and now you have the terror that the unenlightened majority may be won back by their capitalist masters and may kick you out of control, or even stand you up against the wall and shoot you by a firing squad. And all the time you are worrying over these problems, who can estimate the total amount the factory might have been producing if it had been running at full blast? Whatever that difference is, remember, it is paid by the workers, and might that sum not just as well have been used to buy out the owners? If we were back in the old days of hand labor and crude, unorganized production, I admit that the only way to benefit the slaves might be to turn out the masters by force. But here we have a social system of infinite complexity, a delicate and sensitive machine which no one person in the world and no group of persons understands thoroughly. In the running of such a machine, a slight blunder may cost a fortune, and certainly all the skill, all the training, all the loyal services of our expert engineers and managers is needed if we are to remodel that machine while keeping it running. The amount of wealth which we could save by the achieving of that feat would be sufficient to maintain a class of owners in idleness and luxury for a generation. And so I say, with all the energy and conviction I possess, pay them. Pay them anything that is necessary in order to avoid civil war and social disorganization. Pay them so much that they can have no possible cause of complaint, that the most hidebound, capitalist-minded judge in the country cannot find a legal flaw in the bargain. Pay them so that every engineer and efficiency expert and manager and foreman and stenographer and office boy will stay on the job and work double time to put the enterprise through. Pay them such a price that even Judge Gary and John D. Rockefeller will be willing to help us do the job of social readjustment. Ah, yes, my radical friends will say, that sounds all very beautiful, but it's the old utopian dream of brotherhood and class cooperation. That will never happen on this earth until you have first abolished capitalism. My answer is, it could happen tomorrow if we had sufficient intelligence to make it happen. That it does not happen is simply absence of intelligence. And will anyone maintain that it is the part of an intelligent man to advocate a less intelligent course than he knows? What is the use of our intelligence if we abdicate its authority and give ourselves up to programs of action which we know are blind and destructive and wasteful? We may see a great vessel going on the rocks, we may feel certain that it is going, in spite of everything we can do, but shall we fail to do what we can to make those in the vessel realize how they might get safely into harbor? We have had the Russian Revolution before us for 4 years. Mankind will spend the next 100 years in studying it, and still have much to learn, but the broad outlines of the great experiment are now plain before our eyes. Russia was a backward country, and she tried to fight a modern war, and it broke her down. She had practically no middle class, and her ruling class was rotten, and so the revolutionists had their chance, and they seized it. Perhaps it would be more correct to say that they came to the rescue of Russia, saving her from the hands of those who were trying to force her to fight when she was utterly exhausted and incapable of fighting. Anyhow, here was your dictatorship of the proletariat. It turned out all the executive experts, or nearly all of them, because they were tainted with the capitalist psychology, and then straightway it had to call them back and make terms with them, because industry could not be run without them. And of course these engineers and managers sabotaged the revolution. Every non-proletarian sabotaged it, both inside Russia and outside. You denounced this and protested against this, but all the same it happened. It was human nature that it should happen, and it is one of the things you have to count on in any and every country where you attempt the social revolution by minority action. They have got power in Russia, and they dream of getting power in America in the same way. But there is no such disorganization in our country as there was in Russia, and it would take a generation of civil strife to bring us to such a condition. We have a middle class, powerful, thoroughly organized, and thoroughly conscious. Moreover, this class has ideals of majority rule, which are bred in its very bones, and while they have never realized these ideals, they think they have, and they are prepared to fight to the last gasp in that belief. All that the leaders of Moscow have to do is to bring about an attempt at forcible revolution, and they will discover in American society sufficient power of organization and of brutal action to put their movement out of business for a generation. 100 years ago, we had chattel slavery firmly fixed as the industrial system of one half of the United States. To far-seeing statesmen, it was manifest that chattel slavery was a wasteful system and that it could not exist in competition with free labor. There was a great American, Henry Clay, who came forward with a proposition that the people of the United States, through their government, should raise the money, about $1 billion, and compensate the owners of all slaves and set them free. For most of his lifetime, Henry Clay pleaded for this plan. But the masters of the South were making money fast. They knew how to handle the Negro as a slave. They could not imagine handling him as a free laborer, and they would not hear to the plan. On the other side of Mason and Dixon's line were fanatical men of principle, who said that slavery was wrong, and that was the end of it. There is a stanza by Emerson discussing this question of confiscation versus compensation. Pay ransom to the owner, and fill the bag to the brim. Who is the owner? The slave is owner, and ever was. Pay him. This, you see, is magnificent utterance, but as economic philosophy, it is reckless and unsound. The abolitionists of the North took up this poem, and the slave power of the South answered with a battle song. War to the hilt, theirs be the guilt who fetter the freeman to ransom the slave. And so the issue had to be fought out. It cost 1 million human lives and 5 billions of treasure, and it set American civilization back a generation. And now we confront exactly the same kind of emergency, and are coming to exactly the same method of solution. We have white wage slaves clamoring for their freedom, and we have businessmen making money out of them, and exercising power over them, and finding it convenient and pleasant. They are going to fight it out in a civil war, and which side is going to win, I am not sure. But when the historians come to write about it a couple of generations from now, let them be able to record that there were a few men in the country who pleaded for a sane and orderly and human solution of the problem, and who continued to voice their convictions even in the midst of the cruel and wasteful strife. End of chapter 67. Chapters 68 and 69 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 68. The Problem of the Land discusses the land values tax as a means of social readjustment and compares it with other programs. The writer of this book has been watching the social process for 20 years, trying to figure out one thing: how the change from competition to cooperation can be brought about with the minimum of human waste. He has come to realize that the first step is a mental one, to get the people to want the change. That means that the program must be simple, so that the masses can understand it. As a social engineer, you might work out a perfect plan, but find yourself helpless because it was hard to explain. As illustration of what I mean, I cite the single tax, a theory which has a considerable hold in America, but which politically has been utterly ineffective. A few years ago, a devoted enthusiast in Southern California, Luke North, started what he called the Great Adventure, to set free the idle land. In the campaign of 1918, I gave my help to this movement, and when it failed, I went back and took stock and revised my conclusions concerning the single tax. Theoretically, the movement has a considerable percentage of right on its side. Land, in the sense that single taxers use it, meaning all the natural sources of wealth, is certainly an important basis of exploitation. And if you were to tax land values to the full extent, you would abolish a large portion of privilege. Just how large would be hard to figure. I was perfectly willing to begin with that portion, so I helped with the great adventure. But a practical test convinced me that it could never persuade a majority of the people. The single tax proposal is to abolish all taxes except the tax on land values. Then come the associations of the bankers and merchants and real estate speculators, crying in outraged horror, "What? You propose to let the rich man's stocks and bonds go free? You propose to put no tax on his cash in the vaults and on his wife's jewels? You propose to abolish the income tax and the inheritance tax, and put all the costs of the government on the poor man's lot?" Now, of course, I know perfectly well that the rich man dodges most of his income tax and most of his inheritance tax. I know that he pays a nominal pittance on his cash in the bank and on his wife's jewels, and likewise on his stocks and bonds. I know that the corporations issuing these stocks and bonds would be far more heavily hit by a tax on the natural resources they own. They could not evade this tax, and they know it. And that is why they are moved to such deep concern for the fate of the poor man and his lot. I know that the tax on the poor man's lot would be infinitesimal in comparison with the tax on the great corporation. But how can I explain all this to the poor man? To understand it requires a knowledge of the complexities of our economic system, which the voters simply have not got. How much easier to take the bankers and speculators at their word, to answer, "All right, gentlemen, since you like the income and inheritance taxes, the taxes on stocks and bonds and money and jewels, we will leave these taxes standing. Likewise, we assent to your proposition that the poor man should not pay taxes on his lot, while there are rich men and corporations in our state holding 20 million acres of land out of use for purposes of speculation. We will therefore arrange a land values tax on a graduated basis, after the plan of the income tax. We will allow $1,000 or $2,000 worth of land exempt from all taxation, provided it is used by the owner, and we will put a graduated tax on all individuals and corporations owning a greater quantity of land, so that, in the case of individuals and corporations owning more than $10,000 worth of land, we will take the full rental value, and thus force all idle land into the market." Now, the provision above outlined would have spiked every single argument used by the opposition to the great adventure in California in 1918. It would have made the real intent of the measure so plain as to win automatically the additional votes needed to carry the election. But I tried for 3 years without being able to persuade a single one of the great adventure leaders to recognize this plain fact. The single taxer has his formula: the land values tax and no other tax, and all else is heresy. Actually, the president of a big single tax organization in the East declared that by the advocacy of my idea, I had betrayed the single tax. We may take this as an illustration of the difference between dogmatism and science in the strategy of the class struggle. I first suggested my program immediately after the war, with the provision that the land thrown on the market should be purchased by the state and used to establish cooperative agricultural colonies for the benefit of returned soldiers. But we have preferred to have our returned soldiers stay without work, or to displace the men and women who had been gallantly doing their bit. By this means we soon had 5 million men out of work, and many other millions bitterly discontented with their wages. Again, I took up the proposition for a graduated land tax, with the suggestion that the money should be used to provide a pension, first for every dependent man or woman over 60 years of age in the country, and second for every child in the country whose parents were unable properly to support it, whether because they were dead or sick or unemployed. You may note that in advocating this program, you would not have to convert anybody to any foreign theories, nor would you have to use any long words. You would not have to say anything against the Constitution, nor to break any law, nor to give occasion for patriotic mobs to tar and feather you. To every poor man in your state you could say, if you own your own house and lot, this bill will lift the taxes from both, and therefore it will mean $50 or $100 a year in your pocket. If you do not own a home, it will take millions of idle acres out of the hands of the speculators and break the price of real estate so that you can have either a lot in the city or a farm in the country with ease. Furthermore, you could say, this measure will have the effect of drawing the unemployed from the cities at once, and so stopping the downward course of wages. At the same time that wages hold firm, the cost of food will go down, because there will be millions more men working on the land. In addition to that, the state will have an enormous income, many millions of dollars a year, taken exclusively from those who are owning and not producing. This money will be expended in saving from suffering and humiliation the old people of the country who have worked hard all their lives and have been thrown on the scrap heap. Also in making certain that every child in the country has food enough and care enough to make him into a normal and healthy human being, so that he can do his share of the work in the world and pay his own way through life. I submit the above measure to those who believe that the road to social freedom lies by some sort of land tax. But before you take it up, I invite you to consider whether there may not be some other way, even easier. There is a homely old saying to the effect that molasses catches more flies than vinegar. And I am always looking for some way that will get the poor what they want, without frightening the rich any more than necessary. I know a certain type of radical whom this question always exasperates. He answers that the opposition will be equally strong to any plan, the rich will do anything for the poor except to get off their backs, and so on. In reply, I mention that among the most ardent radicals I know are half a dozen millionaires. I know one woman who is worth $1 million, who pleads day and night for social revolution, while the people who work for her are devoted and respectful wage slaves. Herbert Spencer said that his idea of a tragedy was a generalization killed by a fact. I shall not say that the existence of millionaire socialists and parlor Bolsheviks kills the theory of the class struggle, but I certainly say that it compels us to take thought of the rich as well as of the poor in planning the strategy of our campaign. And manifestly, if we want to consider the rich, the very last device we shall use is that of a tax. Nobody likes to pay taxes. Everybody agrees in classifying taxes with death. Each feels that he is paying more than his share already. Each knows that the government which collects the tax is incompetent, or worse. And stop and recall what we have proven about the iron ring, the possibilities of production latent in our society. Realize the bearings of this all-important fact, that we can offer to mankind a social revolution which will make everybody richer instead of making some people poorer. Exactly how to do this is the next thing we have to inquire. End of chapter 68. Chapter 69. The control of credit. Deals with money, the part it plays in the restriction of industry, and may play in the freeing of industry. How is it that the rich are becoming richer? The single taxer answers that it is by monopoly of the land, the natural sources of wealth. The socialist answers that it is by the control of the machinery of production. But if you go among the rich and make inquiry, you speedily learn that these factors, large as they are, amount to little in comparison with another factor, the control of credit. There are hosts of little capitalists and businessmen who deal in land and produce goods with machinery, but the men who make the real fortunes and dominate the modern world are those who control credit, and whose business it is, not the production of anything, but speculation and the manipulation of markets. Money makes the mare go, our ancestors used to say, and money today determines the destiny of empires. What is money? We think of it as gold and silver coins and pieces of engraved paper promising to pay gold and silver coins. But the report of the U.S. Comptroller of the Currency for 1919 shows that the business of the country was done 5% by such means and 95% by checks. So for practical purposes, we may say that money consists of men's willingness to trust other men, or groups or organizations of men when they make written promises to pay. In other words, money is credit, and the control of credit means the control of industry. The problem of social readjustment is mainly but the problem of taking the control of credit out of the hands of private individuals and making it a public or social function. Who controls credit today? The bankers. And how do they control it? We give it to them. We, the masses of the people, who take them our money and leave it with them. And very little real money in hand becomes, under our banking system, the basis of a great amount of imaginary money. The Federal Reserve law requires the bank shall hold in reserve from 7 to 13% of demand deposits, which means, in substance, that when you leave $1 with the banker is allowed, under the law, to turn that dollar into anywhere from $7 to $13 and lend those dollars out. In addition, he deposits his reserves with the Federal Reserve Bank, and that bank keeps only 35% in reserve. In other words, the 7 to 13 imaginary dollars are multiplied again by 3. Under the stress of war, this process of credit inflation has been growing like the genie let out of the bottle. Under the law, the Federal Reserve banks are supposed to hold a gold reserve of 40% to secure our currency. But in December 1919, these banks held a trifle over $1 billion worth of gold, while our paper money was over $4 billion. In addition, our banks have over 33 billions of deposits, and all these are supposed to be secured by gold. In addition, there are 25 billions of government bonds, and uncounted billions of private notes, bonds, and accounts, all supposed to be payable in gold. So it appears that about 1% of our outstanding money is real, and the rest is imaginary. That is, it is credit. The point for you to get clear is this: the great mass of this imaginary money is created by law, and we have the power to abolish it or to change the ownership of it at any time we develop the necessary intelligence. Let us consider the ordinary paper money, the $1 and $2 and $5 and $10 bills with which we plain people do most of our business. These are Federal Reserve notes, and there are about 3 billion of them. How do they come to be? Why, we grant to the national banks by law the right to make this money. The government prints it for them, and they put it into circulation. And what does it cost them? They pay 1% for the use of the money. In some cases, they pay only 0.5%, and then they lend it to us, the people, and what do they charge us? The answer is available in a recent report of the U.S. Comptroller of the Currency, as follows. I have the record of the loans made by one Texas national bank to a hard-working woman who owned a little farm a few miles from town. She borrowed in the aggregate $2,375, making about 30 loans during the year. Listen to the details of the robbery. $162.50 for 30 days at 36%. $377 for 34 days at 44%. $620.25 for 23 days at 77%. $11 for 30 days at 120%. $21.50 for 30 days at 90%. $33 for 2 days at 93%. $27 for 15 days at 195%. $110 for 30 days at 120%. That was to buy a horse for her plowing. $20 for 48 days at 187%. $6 for 10 days at 720%. $7 for 3 days at 2,000%, and so on, every cent paid off by what sweat and struggle only God knows. In Oklahoma, where the legal rate of interest is 6%, with 10% as the maximum under special contract, harassed farmers paid all the way from 12 to 2,400%, with 40% as the average. In the case of one bank, the comptroller proved that not a single solitary loan had been made under 15%. He cited one particular case that he asked to be regarded as typical. In the spring, the farmer went to the bank and arranged for a loan of $200. Out of his necessity, he was compelled to pay 55% interest charge. Unable to meet the note at maturity, he had to agree to 100% interest in order to get the renewal. The next renewal forced him to pay up to 125%. For 4 years the thing went on, and all the drudgery of the father and the mother and the 6 children could never keep down the terrible interest or wipe out the principal. As a finish, the bank swooped down and sold him out. The wretched man, barefoot and hungry, went to work clearing a swamp, caught pneumonia, and died. The county buried him, and neighbors raised a purse to send the widow and children back to friends in Arkansas. This is the thing called the money trust in action, and this is the power we have to take out of private control. It is our first job, and all other jobs are in comparison hardly worth mentioning. How are we going to do it? The farmers of North Dakota have shown one way. They took the control of their state government into their own hands, and the most important and significant thing they did was to start a public bank. The interests fought them tooth and nail, not merely the interests of North Dakota, not merely of the Northwest, but of the entire United States. They fought them in the law courts up to the United States Supreme Court, which decided in favor of the people of North Dakota. Therefore, make note of this vital fact, the most important single fact in the strategy of the class struggle. Every state can, under the Constitution, have a public bank. Every city and town can have one, and no court can ever forbid it. Therefore, I say to all socialists, labormen, and social reformers of every shade and variety, nail at the top of your program of action the demand for a public bank in your community, to take the control of credit out of the hands of speculators and use it for the welfare of the people. Make it your first provision that every dollar of public money shall be deposited in this bank, and every detail of public financing handled by this bank. Make it your second provision that the purpose of this bank shall be to put all private banks out of business and to take over their powers for the people. At present, you understand, it is taken for granted that the first purpose of the government is to foster the private credit system. Take, for example, the Postal Savings Bank. The private banks fought this for a generation, and finally they allowed us to have it, on condition that it should be turned into a device for collecting money for them. Our postal bank turns over all its money to the private banks at the grotesque rate of 2% interest. And recently I read of the director of the postal bank appearing before a convention of bankers, asking for some small favor, and humbly explaining that it was not his idea to make the postal bank a rival of the private savings banks. Why should he not do so? Let us nail it to our radical program that the Postal Savings Bank is to fight for business, just as do the private banks, and lend its funds direct to the people on good security. Let our federal banking system also become the servant of the public welfare, and let its energy be devoted to breaking the stranglehold of predatory finance on our industry. Let the government issue all the money and use it for the transfer of industry from private into public hands. Do we want to socialize our railroads, our coal mines, our telegraphs and telephones? Do we want to buy them in order to avoid the waste of civil war and insurrection? We have agreed that we do, and here we have the way of doing it. If the bankers can create out of our willingness to trust them billions upon billions of imaginary money, then so can we, the people of the United States, create money out of our willingness to trust ourselves. And do not let anybody fool you for a single second by talking about fiat money and inflation of currency. If you are paying twice as much for everything as you did before the war, you are paying it because the bankers have doubled the amount of money in circulation. For that reason and that alone. That double money the bankers own. The only question now to be decided is, who is to own the double money that will be created tomorrow? Make note of the fact that it costs nothing to start a public bank. If you want to put the Steel Trust out of business by competition, you have several $100,000 worth of rolling mills and ore land to buy. But the banks can be put out of business by nothing but a law. The material parts of a bank, the white marble columns and bronze railings and mahogany trimmings, are as nothing compared with the inner soul of a bank, its control of the lifeblood of your business and mine. And this we can have for the taking. We can keep our own credit instead of sending it to Wall Street, where the speculators use it to bleed us white. We could set it to building up our own community under the direction of officials whom we select. Also, we can have our gigantic national bank controlling all our 33 billions of dollars of deposits, and likewise the hundreds of billions of credit built upon them. The first time you suggest this plan to a banker or businessman, you will be told that increase of money by the government does not benefit labor or the general consumer. Inflation of currency causes prices to go up correspondingly. To this I will furnish an effective reply, that at the same time the government issues new money, the government will also fix prices. And then watch the face of your banker or businessman. If he is a man who can really think, and is not just repeating like a parrot the formulas he has learned from others, he will perceive that the combination of currency inflation and price fixing would catch him as the two parts of a nutcracker catch a nut. And he will know that you can take the meat out of him any time you please. He may argue that it is not fair, but point out to him that it is exactly what the big banks and trusts have been doing to us right along. increasing the amount of money in circulation and at the same time raising the prices we pay for goods, and so taking out the meat from us nuts. We have agreed that we do not mean to be unfair either to the banker or the manufacturer. We are simply going to stop their being unfair to us. We are going to convince them that their power to catch us in a nutcracker is forever at an end. We allow them 6% on their investments, and guarantee them this by turning over to them some of our new money, that is, government bonds. When we have thoroughly convinced them that they can't get any more, they will take these bonds and quit. And thus, simply without violence or destruction of property, we shall slide from our present system of commercial cannibalism into the new cooperative commonwealth. We have had cheap money campaigns in the United States many times. And as this book is written, it becomes evident that we are to have another. Henry Ford is advocating the idea, and so is Thomas A. Edison. The present writer would like to make plain that in supporting such a program, he does it for one purpose and one only: the taking over of the industries by the community. The creation of state credit for that purpose is the next step in the progress of human society. Whereas the creation of state credit for the continuance of the profit system is a piece of futility amounting to imbecility. This distinction is fundamental, and is the test by which to judge the usefulness of any new program and the intelligence of those who advocate it. End of chapter 69. Chapters 70, 71, and 72 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 70, The Control of Industry, discusses various programs for the change from industrial autocracy to industrial democracy. The program of the railway workers for the democratic management of their industry is embodied in the Plum Plan. You may learn about it by addressing the weekly paper of the Railway Brotherhoods, which is called Labor, and is published in Washington, D.C. It appears that our transportation industry can be at once socialized because of a clause in the Constitution which gives the national government power over roads and communications. Through decades of mismanagement under the system of private greed, the railroads have been brought to such a financial condition that they will be forced into nationalization whenever we stop them from dipping their fingers into the public treasury. Under the Plum Plan, the government is to purchase the roads from their present owners, paying with government bonds. The management is to be under the control of a board consisting in part of representatives of the government and in part of the workers, this being a combination of the methods of socialism and syndicalism. The same program can be applied constitutionally to telegraphs and telephones, to interstate trolley systems, express companies, oil pipelines, and all other means of interstate communication and distribution. The Plum Plan also deals with coal and steel and other great industries. This could not be nationalized without a constitutional amendment, but it appears that in the majority of the constitutions of the states are provisions that all corporate charters are held subject to the power of the legislature to amend, modify, or revoke the same. That gives us a right to take over these corporations through state action. The only preliminary is to elect state administrations which will represent us instead of representing the corporations. Also, most state constitutions contain the provision that no corporation shall issue its stocks or bonds except for money, labor, or property actually received. The word labor gives the opening wedge for the Plum Plan. The state can purchase these industries, giving bonds in exchange, and can issue to the workers labor stock, which stock will carry part control of the industry. Also, the railroad brotherhoods have started their own bank in Cleveland, Ohio, and it is proving an enormous success. Make note of this point. Every large labor union can have its own bank to finance its industries and its propaganda. Stop and consider how preposterous it is that the 5 million organized workers of the United States should deposit their hundreds of millions of savings in capitalist banks to be used to finance private undertakings which crush unions and hold labor in bondage. Let every big labor union have its own building, its own banking and insurance business, its own vacation camp in the country, its own school for the training of its future leaders. Also, let every labor council in every big city start a labor daily to tell the workers the truth and point the way to freedom. Let every farmers' organization follow suit, and let these groups get together to exchange their products upon a cooperative basis. Already, the railway men are arranging with the farmers to buy the farm products and distribute them cooperatively. They are getting together with the clothing workers to have the latter make clothing for them, and with the shoe workers to make shoes. This is the cooperative movement, which has become the largest single industry in Great Britain, and is the backbone of industrial democracy and sound radicalism. It is spreading rapidly in America now. It is taking the money of the people out of the control of the profit system and diverting it into channels of public service. It is training men to believe in brotherhood instead of in greed. It is giving them business experience, so that when the time comes, the taking over of our industrial machine will not have to be done by amateurs, but by men who know what cooperation is and how to make a success of it. This work will go on more rapidly yet when the workers have united politically and brought into power a government which will assist them instead of assisting the bankers. A most interesting program for the development of working-class financial credit is known as the Douglas Plan, which is advocated by a London weekly, The New Age, and is explained in 2 books called Economic Democracy and Credit Power and Democracy by Douglas and Orage. This program is in brief that the furnishing of credit shall become a function of organized labor based upon the fact that the true and ultimate basis of all credit is the power of hand and brain labor to produce wealth. The labor unions, or guilds, shall pay the management of industry and pay capital for the use of the industrial plant, and shall finance production and new industrial development out of their credit power, their ability to promise production, and to keep their promises. This Douglas Plan seeks to break the money trust by the method of syndicalism. Another method of breaking it, through state regulation of bank loans, you will find most completely set forth in an extremely able book, The Stranglehold, by H.C. Cutting, an American businessman whom you may address at San Lorenzo, California. Another method, utilizing the third factor in industry, the consumer, is the method of banking by consumers' unions. Such are the Raiffeisen banks, widely known in Germany, and a specimen of which exists in the single tax colony at Arden, Delaware. Those who wish to know about the cooperative bank or other forms of cooperation may apply to the Cooperative League of America, 2 West 13th Street, New York, whose president is Dr. James P. Warbasa. Information concerning public ownership may be had from the Public Ownership League, 127 North Dearborn Street, Chicago. also from the Socialist Party, 220 South Ashland Boulevard, Chicago, and from the Bureau of Social Research of the Rand School of Social Science, New York. Also, I ought to mention the very interesting plan for social reconstruction set forth by Mr. King C. Gillette, inventor of the safety razor. This plan you may find in your public library in 2 encyclopedic volumes, Gillette's Social Redemption and Gillette's World Solution. The politician seeks to solve the industrial problem by means of the state, and the labor leader seeks to solve it by the unions. It is to be expected that Mr. Gillette, a capitalist, should seek to solve it by means of the corporation. He points out that the modern trust is the greatest instrument of production yet invented by man, and he asks why the people should not form their own trust to handle their own affairs and to purchase and take over the industries from their present private masters. It is interesting to note that Mr. Gillette's solution is fully as radical and thoroughgoing as those of the state socialists or the syndicalists. The People's Corporation, which he projects and plans someday to launch upon the world, would be a gigantic consumers' union, whose credit power would speedily dominate and absorb all other powers in modern society. It would make us all stockholders and give us our share of the benefits of social productivity. End of chapter 70. Chapter 71, The New World, describes the cooperative commonwealth, beginning with its money aspects, the standard wage, and its variations. It has been indicated that the new society will be different in different countries and in different parts of the same country, in different industries and at different times. No one can predict exactly what it will be, and anyone who tries to predict is unscientific. But every man can work out his own ideas about the most economical and sensible arrangements for a cooperative society. And in these final chapters, I set forth my ideas. One of the first things people ask is, will there be money in the new society? Or, how will labor be rewarded and goods paid for? I answer that there will be money, and the business methods of the new society will be so nearly the same as at present that in this respect you would hardly realize there had been any change. The only difference will be that in the new society you will be paid several times as much for your labor, or, if you prefer to put it the other way, you will be able to buy several times as much with your money. Why should we waste our time working out systems of credit cards when we already have a system in the form of gold and silver coins and paper currency? Why should we bother with labor checks when we have a banking and clearinghouse system understood by everyone but the illiterate? The only difference we shall make is that nobody can get gold and silver coins or paper currency except by performing labor to pay for them. Nobody can have money in the bank and draw checks against it until he has rendered to society an equivalent amount of service. When you have earned your money in the new world, you'll spend it wherever you please and for whatever you please. The only difference being that the price you pay will be the exact labor cost of producing that article, with no deduction for any form of exploitation. As I wrote 16 years ago in the Industrial Republic, you will be able to get, if you insist upon it, a 7-legged spider made of diamonds. And the only question society will ask is, have you performed services equivalent to the material and labor necessary to the creating of that unusual article of commerce? Of course, society won't put you in that complicated formula. It will simply ask, have you got the price? Which, you observe, is exactly the question society asks you at present. The next thing that everybody wants to know is, shall we all be paid the same wages? I answer yes and no, because there will be three systems of payment. There will be a basic wage, which everybody will get for every kind of useful service necessary to production. This will be, as it were, the foundation of our economic structure. On top of this will be built a system of special payments for special services, which are of an intellectual nature and cannot be standardized and dealt with wholesale. In addition, there will be, for a time, a third arrangement applying to agricultural work, which is in a different stage of development, and to which different conditions apply. Let us take first our standard wage. The census of our utopian commonwealth reveals that we have 10 million able-bodied workers engaged in mining, manufacturing, and transportation. This including, of course, office work and management, everything that enters into these industries. By scientific management, the best machinery, and the elimination of all possible waste, we find that they produce $80 million worth of goods an hour. A portion of this we have to set aside to pay for the raw materials which they do not produce, and for the upkeep of the plant, and for margin of error, what our great corporations call a surplus. We find that we have $50 million per hour left, and that means that we can pay for labor $5 per hour, or $20 for the regular 4-hour day. This is our standard wage, received by all able-bodied workers. But quickly we find that our industries are not properly balanced. A great many men want to work at the jobs which are clean and pleasant, such as delivering mail, and very few want to work at washing dishes in restaurants and cleaning the sewers. There is no way we can adjust this except by paying a higher wage, or by reducing the number of hours in the working day, which is the same thing. The only other method would be to have the state assign men to their work, and that would be bureaucracy and slavery, the essence of everything we wish to get away from in our cooperative commonwealth. What we shall have, so far as concerns our basic industries, is a government department registering with mathematical accuracy the condition of supply and demand in all the industries of the country. Our demand for shoes is increasing. For some reason or other, 1,000 more shoe workers are needed. Therefore, the price of labor in the shoe industry is increased 5 cents per day, or whatever amount will draw that number of workers from other occupations. On the other hand, there are too many people applying for the job of driving trucks. Therefore, we reduce slightly the compensation for this work. There are more men who want jobs in Southern California than in Alaska. Therefore, the payment for the same grade of work in Alaska has to be higher. All this is not merely speculation. It is not a matter of anybody's choice. It is an automatic, self-adjusting system, subject to precise calculations. The only change from our present system is from guesswork to exact measurement. At present, we do not know how many shoes our country will require next season. Neither do we know how many shoes are going to be made. Neither do we know how many people can make shoes, nor how many would like to learn, nor how many would like to quit that job and take to farming. It would be the simplest matter in the world to find out these things. Far simpler than it was to register all our possible soldiers and examine them physically and mentally and train them and feed them and ship them overseas to can the Kaiser. Of course, we drafted the men for this war job, but in the New World, nobody is drafted for anything. It is any man's privilege to starve if he feels like it. It is his privilege to go out into the mountains and live on nuts and berries if he can find them. Nobody makes him go anywhere, or makes him work at anything, unless, of course, he is a convicted criminal. To the free citizen, All that society has to say is, if he buys any products, he must pay for those products with his own labor, and not with some other man's labor. Of course, he may steal or cheat, as under capitalism. Our New World has laws against stealing and cheating, and does its best to enforce them. The difference between the capitalist world and our world is merely that we make it impossible for any man to get money legally without working. Under these conditions, the average man wishes to work, and the only question remaining is, how shall he work? If he wants to work by himself and in his own way, nobody objects to it. He is able to buy anything he pleases, whether raw materials or finished products. If he wants to buy leather and make shoes after his own pattern, no one stops him, and if he can find anyone to buy these shoes, he can earn his living in that way. He is able to get land for as long a time as he wants it, by paying to the state the full rental value of that land. And if he wants to farm the land, he can do so, and sell his products. As a matter of theory, he is perfectly free to hire others to farm the land for him or with him. There is no law to prevent it. Neither is there any law to prevent his renting a factory and buying machinery and hiring labor to make the shoes. But, as a matter of practical fact, it is impossible for him to do this because the community is in the business of making shoes, and on an enormous scale, with great factories run democratically by the workers, and there is very small chance of any private businessman being able to draw the workers away from these factories. The community factories have all the latest machinery, they apply the latest methods of scientific management, and they turn out standard shoes at such a rate that private competition is unthinkable. Of course, there may be some special kind of shoes involving an intellectual element in which there can be private competition. This kind of manufacture is covered in our second method of payment. But before we discuss it, let us settle the problem of our most important basic industry, which is agriculture. End of chapter 71. Chapter 72. Agricultural production discusses the land in the New World and how we foster cooperative farming and cooperative homes. Farming the land is a very ancient industry, and while its tools have been improved, its social forms have been the same for a long time. The worker on the land is conservative, and the Russian Bolsheviks, who tried to rush their peasants into communism, found that they had only succeeded in stopping the production of food. We make no such blunder in our new society. We have found a way to abolish speculation in land and exploitation based on land ownership, while leaving the farmer free to run his business in the old way if he wants to. In our new society, we take the full rental value of all land which is not occupied and used by the state. The farmer and the city dweller alike own their land, in the sense that they have the use of it for as long as they please, but they pay to the state the rental value of the land, minus the improvements. So they cannot speculate in the land or rent it out to others, they can only use it. And they only pay for what they actually use. They may put improvements on the land with full assurance of having the use and benefit thereof, and they may sell the improvements, and the new owner enters into possession with no obligation but to pay the rental value of the unimproved land to the state. The farmer goes on raising his products, and if he wants to drive to town to deliver them to his customers, he may do so. But he finds it cheaper to market them through the great labor cooperatives and state markets. As there is no longer any private interest involved in these activities, no one has any interest in cheating him, and he gets the full value of the products, less the cost of marketing. if the farmer wishes to continue all his life in his old-style individualistic method of working the land, he is free to do so. But here is what he sees going on within a few miles of his place. The state has bought a square mile of land, and has taken down the fences and established an agricultural cooperative for purposes of experiment and demonstration. The farm is run under the direction of experts. The soils are treated with exactly the right fertilizers for each crop. The best paying crops are raised, the best seed is used, and the best machinery. The workers of this new agricultural cooperative receive the standard wage, and they live in homes specially built for them, with all the conveniences made possible by wholesale production. Also, these cooperators live in a democratic community. They determine their own conditions of labor, being represented on the governing board, along with the experts appointed by the state. The farmer watches this experiment, at first with suspicion, but he finds that his sons have less suspicion than he has, and his sons keep pointing out to them that their little farm is not making the standard wage or anything like it. And moreover, the standard wage is constantly increasing, whereas the price of farm products is dropping. And here is the state ready to direct new cooperative ventures, inviting a score of farmers in the community to combine and buy out the unwilling ones and establish a new cooperative. Sooner or later, the old farmer gives way, or he dies, and his sons belong to the new world. So ultimately, we have our national agricultural system, in which all the requirements of our people are studied, and all the possibilities of our soil and climate, and the job of raising the exact quantities of food that we need, both for our own use and for export, is worked out as one problem. We know how much lumber we need, and we raise it on all our hillsides and mountain slopes, and so protect ourselves from floods and the denuding of our continent. We know where best to raise our wheat, and where best to raise our potatoes and our cabbages, and we do not do this by crude hand labor, nor by the labor of women and children from daybreak till dark. We have special machines that plant each crop, and other machines that reap it or dig it out of the ground and prepare it for market. A few days ago I read a discussion in the Chamber of Commerce of Calcutta. Someone called attention to the wastes involved in the current method of handling rubber. One consignment of rubber had been sold more than 300 separate times, and the cost of these transactions amounted to 3 times the value of the rubber. This is only one illustration, and I might quote 1,000. If you doubt my figures as to the possibility of production in the new society, remind yourself that a large percentage of the things you use have been bought and sold many scores of times before you get them. Consider the cabbage, for which you pay 6 or 8 cents a pound in the grocery store, and for which the farmer gets, say, half a cent a pound. In this new world, the state has an enormous income derived from its tax on land values. It no longer has to send around men once a year to ask you how many diamond rings your wife has, and to tax you on your honesty, if you have any. It no longer has to make its money by such lying devices as a tariff. Therefore, its moral being is no longer poisoned by a tariff lobby. It taxes every citizen for the right to use that which nature created, and leaves free from taxation that which the citizen's own labor created. This kind of taxation is honest and fair to all, because no one can evade it. The state uses the proceeds of this land tax in the public services, the libraries and research laboratories and information bureaus, in free insurance against fire and flood and tempest, and in a pension to every member of society above the working age of 55, or below the working age of 18. Of course, The state might leave it to every man to save up for his old age, but not all men are this wise, and the state cannot afford to let the unwise ones starve. It is more convenient for the state to figure out that all men, or nearly all, are going to be old, and to hold back some of their money while they are young and strong, in the certainty that when they are old they will appreciate this service. Also, the state takes care of the sick and incapacitated, and the mentally or physically defective. But we do not leave these latter loose in the world to reproduce their defects. We have in our new world some sense of responsibility to the future, and there is nothing to which we devote more effort than making certain that nothing unsound or abnormal is allowed entrance into life. The problem of the care of children is a complicated one, and our new society is in process of solving it. We look back on the old world in which the having of children was heavily taxed, in the form of an obligation to care for these children until they were old enough to work. Then the parents were allowed to exploit the labor of the children, so that among the very poor the raising of children was a business speculation, like the raising of slaves or poultry. But in our new world, we consider the interest of the child and of the society in which that child is to be a citizen. We decide that this society must have citizens, and that the raising of the future citizens is a work just exactly as necessary and useful as the raising of a crop of cabbages. Therefore, we pay a pension to all mothers while they are raising and caring for children. At the same time, we assert the right to see that this money is wisely spent, and that the child is really cared for. If it is neglected, we are quick to take it away from its parents and put it in one of our 24-hour-a-day schools. We realize that the home is an ancient industry, even more ancient than agriculture, and we do not try to socialize it all at once. But just as we demonstrate to farmers that the individual farm does not pay, so we demonstrate to mothers the wastefulness of the single laundry, the single kitchen, the single nursery. We establish community laundries, community kitchens, community nurseries, and invite our women to help in these activities and to learn there under expert guidance the advantages of domestic cooperation. We convince them by showing better results in the health and happiness of the children and in the time and strength of the mothers. So, little by little, we widen the field of cooperative endeavor and increase the total product of human labor and the total enjoyment of human life. End of chapter 72. Chapters 73 and 74 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 73, Intellectual Production, discusses scientific, artistic, and religious activities as a superstructure built upon the foundation of the standard wage. Karl Kautsky, intellectual leader of the German social democracy, gives in his book, The Social Revolution, a useful formula as to the organization of the future society. This formula is communism in material production, anarchism in intellectual production. It will repay us to study this statement and see exactly what it means. Material production depends directly upon things, and as there is only a limited quantity of things in the world, if any one person has more than his share, he deprives some other person to that extent. So there have to be strict laws concerning the distribution of material products. But with intellectual things, exactly the opposite is the case. There is no limit in quantity, and any one person can have all he wants without interfering with anybody else. Everybody in the world can perform a play by Shakespeare or play a sonata by Beethoven, and everybody can enjoy it as much as he pleases, without keeping other people from enjoying it all they please. Also, material production can be standardized. We can have great factories to turn out millions of boxes of matches, each match like every other match, and the more alike they are, the better. But in intellectual affairs, we want everyone to be different, or at least we want everyone to be free to be different. And if someone can become much better than the others, this is the most important kind of production in the world, for he may make over our whole intellectual and moral life. For the production of material things, our new society has great factories, owned in common, and run by majority vote of the workers, and we place the products of that factory at the disposal of all members of society upon equal terms. That is our communism in material production. On the other hand, in our intellectual production, we leave everybody free to live his own life and to associate himself with others of like aims, and we place as few restrictions as possible upon these activities. This is the method of free association, or anarchism in intellectual production. Our problem would be simple if material and intellectual production never had to mingle. But as it happens, every kind of intellectual production requires a certain amount of material, and every kind of material production involves an intellectual element. Therefore, our two methods have to be combined, and we have a complex problem which we have to solve in a variety of different ways, and upon which we must experiment with open minds and scientific temper. First, let us take the intellectual elements involved in the production of purely material things, such as matches and shoes and soap. Let us take invention. Naturally, we do not want to go on making matches and shoes and soap in the same old way forever. On the contrary, we want to stimulate all the workers in these industries to use their wits and improve the processes in every possible way. The whole of society has an interest in this, and the soap workers have an especial interest. Our soap industry has an invention department, with a group of experts appointed by the executive committee of the National Council of Soap Workers. All soap workers are taxed, say, 5 cents a day for the support of this activity. Likewise, the state contributes a generous sum out of its income toward the work of soap research. In addition to this, the soap industry offers prizes and scholarships for suggestions as to the improvement of every detail of the work, and at meetings of every local of soap workers, somebody makes new suggestions as to methods of stimulating their intellectual life, not merely as regards soap, but as regards citizenship and art and literature and human life in general. Our soap workers, you must understand, are no longer wage slaves, brutalized by toil and poverty. They are free citizens of a free society. Our soap workers local in every city has its own theater and concert hall and lecture bureau and publishes its own magazine. Every industry has its immediate intellectual problems, its trade journals in which these are discussed, and its research boards in which they are worked out. The ambitions of the young workers in that industry are concentrated upon getting into this intellectual part of their trade. Examinations are held, and tests are made to discover the most competent men, and written suggestions are considered by boards of control. It is, of course, of great importance to every worker that the channels of promotion should be kept open, and that the man who really has inventive talent shall get, not merely distinction and promotion, but financial reward, so that he may have time and materials to continue his experiments. This research department, you perceive, is a part of superstructure built upon the foundation of our standard wage. And this same simile applies to numerous other forms of intellectual production. For example, our community paper mills turn out paper, and our community printers are prepared to turn out millions of books. How shall we determine what is to be the intellectual content of these material books? There are many different methods. First, there is the method of individualism. A man has something to say, and he writes a book. He works in the soap factory and saves a part of his standard wage, and when he has money enough, he orders the community printers to print his book, and the community booksellers to handle it for him, and the community post office to deliver it for him. Again, a group of men organize themselves into an association or club or scientific society and publish books. The Authors' League takes up the work of publishing the writings of its members, and the Poetry Society does the same. This is the method of anarchism, or free association. But there is no reason why we should not have alongside it the method of socialism. There is no reason why we should not have state publishing houses, just as we have state universities and state libraries. The state should certainly publish standard works of all sorts, Bibles and dictionaries and directories and cheap editions of the classics. In this new world, our school boards are not chosen by businessmen for the purpose of graft. They are chosen by the people to educate our children. So it seems to us perfectly natural that the National Education Association should conduct a publication department and order the printing of the school books which the children use. In the same way, anyone is free to write a play, or to put on a play and invite people to come and see it. But, like the individual farmers and the individual mothers of families, the play producer in our society is in competition with great community enterprises, which set a high standard and make competition difficult. The same thing applies to the opera, and to concerts, and to all the arts and sciences. You can start a private hospital if you wish, but you will be in competition with public institutions, and you can only succeed if you are a man of genius. That is, if you have something to teach too new and startling for the public boards of control to recognize. You try your new method, and it works, and that becomes a criticism of the public boards of control, and before long the people by their votes turn out the old board of control and put you in. That is politics, you say. But we, in our new world, do not use the word politics as one of contempt. We really believe that public sentiment is in the long run the best authority, and the appeal to public sentiment is at once a social privilege and a social service. What we strive to do is to clear the channels of appeal and avoid favoritism and stagnation. To that end, we maintain in every art and every science and every department of human thought endless numbers of centers of free, independent, cooperative activity, so that every man who has an inspiration or a new idea can find some group to support him, or can form a new group of his own. This is our anarchism in intellectual production. And it is the method under which in capitalist society men organize all their clubs and societies and churches. Devout members of the Roman Catholic Church will be startled to be told that theirs is an anarchist organization. But nevertheless, such is the case. The Catholic Church owns a great deal of property and speculates in real estate, and to that extent it is a capitalist institution. It holds a great many people by fear, and to that extent it is a feudal institution. But insofar as members of the church believe in it and love it and contribute of their free will to its support, They are organizing by the method which all anarchists recommend and desire to apply to the whole of society. Anarchist clubs and Christian churches are both free associations for the advocacy of certain ideas, the only difference being in the ideas they advocate. In our new world, such organizations have been multiplied many-fold and form a vast superstructure of intellectual activity, built upon the foundation of the standard wage. In this new world, all the people are free. They are free, not merely from oppression, but from the fear of oppression. They have leisure and plenty, and they take part naturally and simply in the intellectual life. The old, of course, have not got over the dullness which a lifetime of drudgery impressed upon them, but the young are growing up in a world without classes, and in which it seems natural that everyone should be educated and everyone should have ideas. They earn their standard wage and devote their spare time to some form of intellectual or artistic endeavor, and spend their spare money in paying writers and artists and musicians and actors to stimulate and entertain them. These latter are the ways of distinction in our new society. These are the paths to power. The only rich men in our world are the men who produce intellectual goods, the great artists, orators, musicians, actors, and writers who are free to serve or not to serve as they see fit, and can therefore hold up the public for any price they care to charge. Just now, there is eager discussion going on in our world as to whether it is proper for an opera singer or a moving picture star or a novelist to make $1 million. Our newspapers are full of discussions of the question whether anyone can make $1 million honestly, and whether men of genius should exploit their public. Some point out that our most eminent opera singer spends his millions in endowing a conservatory of art, but others maintain that it would be better if he lowered his prices of admission and let the public use its money in its own way. The extremists are busy founding what they call the 10-cent society, whose members agree to boycott all singers and actors who charge more than 10 cents admission, and all moving picture stars who receive more than $100,000 a year for their service. These 10-centers do not object to paying the money, but they object to the commercializing of art, and declare especially that the moral effects of riches is such that no rich person should ever, under any circumstances, be allowed to influence the youth of the nation. In this, some of the greatest writers join them, and renounce their copyrights, and agree to accept a laureateship from some union of workers, who pay them a generous stipend for the joy and honor of being associated with their names. The greatest poet of our time began life as a newsboy, and so the National Newsvendors Society has adopted him and taken his name, and pays him $10,000 a year for the privilege of publishing his works. End of chapter 73. Chapter 74. Mankind Remade. Discusses human nature and its weaknesses, and what happens to these in the new world. We have briefly sketched the economic arrangements of the cooperative commonwealth. Let us now consider what are the effects of these arrangements upon the principal social diseases of capitalism. The first and most dreadful of capitalism's diseases is war. And the economic changes here outlined have placed war, along with piracy and slavery, among the half-forgotten nightmares of history. We have broken the iron ring, and are no longer dependent upon foreign concessions and foreign markets for the preservation of our social system and the aggrandizement of a ruling class. We can stay quietly at home and do our own work, and as we produce nearly everything we need, We no longer have to threaten our neighbors. Our neighbors know this, and therefore they do not arm against us, and we have no pretext to arm against them. We take toward all other civilized nations the attitude which we have taken toward Canada for the past 100 years. We have a small and a highly trained army, a few regiments of which are located at strategic points over the country. This army we regard and use as we do our fire department. When there is widespread damage by fire or flood or storm or earthquake, we rush the army to the spot to attend to the work of rescue and rebuilding. Also, we have a small navy in international service, for, of course, we are no longer an independent and self-centered nation. We have come to realize that we are part of the world community and have taken our place as one state in the International Socialist Federation. We send our delegates to the World Parliament, and we place our resources at the disposal of the world government. However, it now takes but a small army and navy to preserve order in the world. We govern the backward nations, but the economic arrangements of the world are such that we are no longer driven to exploit and oppress them. We send them teachers instead of soldiers. And as there are really very few people in the world who fight for the love of fighting, we have little difficulty in preserving peace. We pay the backward peoples a fair price for their products, which we need. Our world government takes no money out of these countries, but spends it for the benefit of those who live in the countries, to teach them and train their young generations for self-government. Next, what are the effects of our new arrangements upon political corruption and graft? The social revolution has broken the prestige of wealth. Money will buy things, but it no longer buys power, the right to rule other men. It no longer buys men's admiration. Everybody now has money, and nobody is any longer afraid of starvation. It is no longer the fashion to save money, any more than it is the fashion to carry revolvers in drawing rooms or to wear chainmail in place of underclothing. So our political life is cleansed of the money influence. People now get power by persuading their fellows, not by buying them or threatening them. The world is no longer full of men ravenous for jobs and ready to sell their soul for a position. So it is no longer possible to build up a machine based on desire for office. The changes have resulted in an enormous intensification of our political activities. We have endless meetings and debates. We have so many propaganda societies that we cannot keep track of them. And some of these societies, like the Catholic Church, have a large membership and large sums of money at their disposal. But a few experiments at carrying elections by a campaign chest have convinced everybody that to have the facts on your side is the only permanent way to political power. Our new society is jealous of attempts to establish any sort of ruling class, and the surest way to discredit yourself is to advocate any form of barrier against freedom of discussion, or the right of the people's will to prevail. Next, what is the status of crime? We have too recently escaped from capitalism to have been able to civilize entirely our slum population, and we still have occasional crimes of violence, especially crimes of passion, but we have almost entirely eliminated those classes of crimes which had to do with property, and we have discovered that this was 95% of all crime. We have eliminated them by the simple device of making them no longer profitable. Anybody can go into our community factories and under clean and attractive working conditions, and without any loss of prestige or social position, can earn the means of satisfying his reasonable wants by 3 hours of work a day. Almost everybody finds this easier than stealing or cheating. But more important yet, as a factor in abolishing crime is the abolition of class domination and the prestige of wealth. We no longer have in our community a ruling class which lives without working, and which offers to the weak-minded and viciously inclined the perpetual example of luxury. We no longer set much store on jewels and fine raiment. We do not make costly things, except for public purposes, where all may enjoy them, and nobody stores great quantities of money because everyone has a guarantee of security from the state. So we are gradually putting our policemen and jailers and judges and lawyers to constructive work. Next, what about disease? The diseases of poverty are entirely done away with. We are now able to apply the knowledge of science to the whole community, and so we no longer have to do with tuberculosis and typhoid, or with rickets and anemia in children, or with heavy infant mortality. We have sterilized our unfit, the degenerates and the defectives, and so do not have to reckon with millions of children from these wretched stocks. We now give to the question of public health that prominence which in the old days we used to give to war and the suppression of crime and social protest. Our public health officers now replace our generals and admirals, and we really obey their orders. Next, as to prostitution. Just as in the case of crime, we are still too close to capitalism not to have among us the victims of social depravity, both men and women. We still have a great deal of vice which springs from untrained animal impulse, and we have some cultivated and highly sophisticated pornography. But we have entirely done away with the commercial vice, and we have done it by cutting the root which nourished it. Women in our communities are really free, and by that we do not mean the empty political freedom which existed in the days of wage slavery. We mean that women are permanently delivered from economic inferiority by the recognition on the part of the state of the money value of their special kind of work, the bearing and training of children. This kind of work not merely receives the standard wage, it also receives the best surgical and nursing treatment free. Housework and homemaking are legally recognized services, and the woman before marriage and after her children have been nursed is free to go into the community factories and earn for herself the standard wage, with no loss of social position. Consequently, no woman sells her sex, and no man buys it. This does not mean, of course, that we have solved the sex problem in our new society. There are two great social problems with which we have to deal. The first of these being the sex problem, and the second the race problem. Our scientists are occupied with eugenics, and we are finding out how to guide our young people in marriage so that our race may be built up and the ravages of capitalism remedied as quickly as possible. Also, we are trying to find out the laws of happiness and health in love. We are founding societies for the purpose of protecting love, and as hinted in the Book of Love, we have a determined social structure between two groups of women, the mother women and the mistress women. Those who take love gravely as a means of improving the race, and those who take it as a decoration, a form of play. Our men are embarrassed by having to choose between these groups, and occupy themselves with trying to keep the struggle from turning into civil war. Second, the race problem. Our economic changes have, of course, done away with some of the bitterest phases of this strife. White working men in the North no longer mob and murder Negro working men for taking their jobs, and in the South our land values tax prevents the landlord from exploiting either white or Negro labor. But our white race is still irresistibly bent upon preserving its integrity of blood, and the more far-seeing among the Negroes have come to realize that there can never be any real happiness for them in a society where they are denied the higher social privileges. There is a movement for the development of a genuine Negro republic in Africa and for mass emigration. Also, there is a proposition, soon to be settled at an election, for the dividing of the United States into 3 districts upon racial lines. First, there are to be in the far South 3 or 4 states which are inhabited and governed solely by Negroes, and to which white men may come only as temporary visitors; a large group of states in the North, which are white states, and to which Negroes may come only as visitors; and finally a middle group of states in which both whites and blacks are allowed to live, as at present, but with the proviso that no one may live there who takes part in any form of racial strife or agitation. This program gives to race-conscious Negroes their own land, their own civilization, their own chance of self-realization. It gives to race-conscious white men the same opportunity, and it leaves to those who are not troubled by the problem a country where black and white may dwell in quite good fellowship. Finally, what has been the effect of our economic changes upon the purely personal vices which gave us so much trouble and unhappiness in the old days? What, for example, has been the effect upon vanity? You should see our new crop of children in our high schools. There are no longer any social classes among them. The rich ones do not arrive in private automobiles to make the poor ones envious, and they do not isolate themselves in little snobbish cliques. They arrive in community automobiles, and all wear uniforms, one of the simple devices by which we repress the impulse of the young toward display of personal egotism. They are all full of health and happy play, and their heads are busily occupied with interesting ideas. Our girls are trained to thinking instead of to personal adornment. They are developing their minds instead of catching a rich husband by sexual charms. So we have been able in a single generation of training to make a real and appreciable difference in the amount of vanity and self-consciousness to be found among our young people. And the same thing applies to a score of other undesirable qualities, which, under the system of competitive commercialism, were overstimulated in human beings. In those old days, everyone was seeking his own survival, and certain qualities which had survival value became the principal characteristics of our race. Those qualities were greed and persistence in acquisitiveness, cunning and subtlety, also bragging and self-assertiveness. In that old world, people destroyed their fellows in order to make their own safety and power. They wasted goods in order to be esteemed, to preserve what they called their social position. But now we have cut the roots of all these vile weeds. We have so adjusted the business relationships of men that we do not have to have hysterical religious revivals in order to keep the human factors alive in their hearts. We have established it as a money fact which everyone quickly realizes that it pays better to cooperate. There is more profit and less bother in being of service to others. So we have prepared a soil in which virtues grow instead of vices, and we find that people become decent and kindly and helpful without exhortation, and with no more moral effort than the average man can comfortably make. Of course, we have still personal vices to combat, and new virtues to discover and to propagate, but this has to do with the future, whereas we are here confining ourselves to those things which have been demonstrated in our new society. End of chapter 74. End of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair.